break free from emotional overeating and find your healthy weight for life. And many of you know me as a love, dating, and relationships coach and the author of How to Fall in Love. And if you've read my book, you'll know that overeating and numbing my feelings and disconnecting from my feelings through food, as well as alcohol and other compulsive behaviors, was part of my story, a big part of my story. So for many years, I wore my pain on the outside. So this is just to give you an idea of where I got to with my overeating. And, you know, I feel sad when I see these pictures. This was in my late teens, early 20s, university and after university. And I had been binge eating from my late teens when I first put on weight. And then I was trapped in a cycle of binge eating, starving, compulsively exercising. Binge drinking was part of it, as was, unhealthy relationships, mindless sex, drunk sex, drugs for a while when I was living in Mexico, and anything that would detach me from my feelings and help me to feel some comfort or some confidence or some courage, to feel soothed in some way. So I am here because I have been on a journey of transformation in relation to how I eat and how I relate to my body and how I relate to my feelings. So in my 20s, I was wearing my pain on the outside, and there were so many hangovers, not only the alcohol hangover from all the binge drinking, but also the shame I felt from overeating, the self-disgust and the self-hate and the self-judgment and the self-criticism. I gave myself such a hard time for these behaviors. And then then I was wearing my pain on the inside. So through unhealthy means, I lost weight in my late 20s, early 30s. I was living in Brazil, Mexico and Brazil. I went to see a doctor. They gave me some diet pills. They were like amphetamines. So I was racing for a long time. I was doing a lot of sport and exercise. Sport is great. Exercise is great. I'm just going to let someone in. But also I was, I was punishing myself with exercise. I was harming myself with exercise. So I was not taking care of myself. So I was wearing my pain on the inside. So nobody knew, I had a smile on my face. My body was a normal size, but I was in a lot of pain on the inside and I was still overeating. So these pictures are taken when I was reporting for Reuters. I was based in Parliament. I traveled with the Prime Minister a lot. And this was the start of my recovery journey. So I had a little bit of healing from overeating. I had a bit of space between what I'll talk about later, the stimulus and response. So I wasn't always going to the food, but sometimes I was. So I might be traveling around with the Prime Minister, and then I'd get to the hotel, to the minibar, and I would binge and binge and binge until I felt sick. And then I would run and run and run. And because I managed my weight, nobody knew what was going on the inside. So I'll just go back to, as we've had some people join, just go back to these pictures. I was saying that in my 20s, so from my late teens through my 20s, I was several stone heavier than I am now and really disliked my body and hated the way I looked. And it was a cycle. So if I hate the way I look, I'm just going to binge again and drink more. And so that's where I got to. And then I was wearing my pain on the on the inside. So I had lost some weight. I still didn't love the way I looked, but I was wearing my pain on the inside. So, and this has been the transformation, and this isn't a diet club, or it's not about saying we have to be a certain weight or slim is better than not being slim. This is about how we feel about ourselves and how we are treating our bodies and how connected we are to ourselves, and whether the behaviors are causing us a cost, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the transformation and the healing power of feeling our feelings. You know, for years I didn't wear shorts, I didn't wear crop tops, I didn't wear anything that exposed my arms. I spent a lot of time on the beach because I lived in Mexico and Brazil, but I did wear bikinis, but I hated the way I looked. And you know, I'm not saying that every moment I step on the beach in a bikini, I feel like I look amazing. But the fact that I can wear shorts and I can wear t-shirts and I can wear bikinis without spending my entire time thinking about how I look and what people will think or what I've eaten or how to get rid of the food. So the amount of headspace it took up was incredible. What I'd like you to do first is think about the cost of your behaviors. So as we said at the beginning, it's not always overeating. It could be undereating. It could be some form of disordered eating. It could be drinking. It could be sleeping around. It could be texting your ex. These are all behaviors that are, I suppose, they're out of our control. We don't have control over them. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about what it costs you to be engaged in these behaviors. And it might be about food. And if I can just give you an idea of what it cost me. So there was a physical cost, as you saw from those pictures. I was 11, 12 stone. I hated the way I looked. My eating on sugar, binge eating on sugar affected my teeth and my gums. The vomiting that I used to do primarily after binge drinking had a huge impact on my gut and my digestion and my stomach. So there's the physical cost. Then there was the relationship cost. So when I was overweight, I had this kind of defense around me, this barrier, this fortress, stay away. Or, you know, I did actually date and I was having relationships. But if I didn't love myself, I was also attracting people who weren't going to love and care for me. And I was accepting anything because I didn't really care for myself. So there was the relationship cost. And also the you know, long-term relationship cost. So I'm not connected to my feelings. I'm not caring for myself. How can I connect to someone else on an intimate level? And how can I empathize with their feelings? How can I meet them on an intimate level? So there was the health cost, relationship cost, spiritual cost. I was totally disconnected from any form of spirituality, from any form of connection to nature or my higher self or God or spirituality or faith. I was totally disconnected because it was all about the food, how to get the food, how to eat it, how to lose it, how to lose the weight. There was the career cost because for years I stayed in a profession that was no longer feeding my soul, and I survived it through overeating and binge drinking and so forth. And since since I've had this transformation, then I'm able to be much more creative and in touch with my creativity. I have a lot more time and headspace for people, for my emotions, for my creativity. And there were lots of other costs. So I'd like you just to take a moment in your notebooks to think about the cost to you, to your to the different areas of your life of emotional eating, or of any other sort of addictive or compulsive behavior that it feels beneficial to look at. So we're talking about scrolling on your phone, having unhealthy relationships, working too hard, drinking too much, numbing out on TV. So I'd like you to think of the cost. And so if you write that down first, and then if you're willing, feel free to share anything that comes up for you in the chat. The chat isn't recorded, so feel free to say whatever you wish. So blame and shame, for this is some of the cost that people are sharing. The blame and shame that we feel for feeling out of control, for eating too much or scrolling too much. And that's, I totally relate to that. The self-criticism that comes afterwards, the self-blame that comes afterwards, it's a cycle of punishment and self-harm. So I punish myself to begin with, and then I punish myself for what I have just done. And it's a cycle, and it's a vicious cycle. Self-criticism for not being better. Yeah, for not being able to do it right, or for not being able to manage life without these things. And it keeps me alone. So that's very profound. I can absolutely relate to that. Although in my binge eating years, I was surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, boyfriends, in and out, off and on. In terms of emotional connection to others, I was very alone. And when I was overweight, I really do think it was a barrier to people. Stay away from me. Don't get close to me. Don't get to know me. So yeah, it keeps people away, and it's a block to intimacy. Yeah, so it stops me from doing things that sound really enjoyable, like lying in the sun and feeling the warmth on my skin, swimming because I don't feel right in my body. Yeah, that sense of being not comfortable in our own skin. Gosh, that sends tingles through my body. I mean, what a joy to feel comfortable in our own skin. Surely that is a gift of life. Imagine when we're born, when we have that beautiful skin and we are comfortable in our skin because we know no different. And then it begins at some point, and the shame and the self-judgment, and then we don't feel comfortable in our own skin. And imagine being in relationships, intimate relationships, even friendships, work, all relationships, if we don't feel comfortable in our own skin. Hiding from people who admired me when I was thinner. Yeah. So, for me, it was a real defense and barrier. So, and that barrier to people continued even when I was slim, because I was still engaged in the behaviors, even though I'd lost the weight. I was still numbing and detaching from myself. Yeah, so not feeling comfortable in my own skin. And, I hope that, gosh, it would be such a miracle and breakthrough, wouldn't it, for those of us who don't feel comfortable in our own skin to feel comfortable in our own skin. And this is a short workshop and a whistle stop tour, and I can't claim to make miracles happen in a short amount of time, but I hope that there is some light bulb moments and some mini breakthroughs, and it sets you off on a better path. So we're going to come back to that, what it would feel like. Yeah, how do we feel more comfortable in our own skin? Actually, I'll ask that now. Maybe you want to share about how might you feel more comfortable in your own skin? What would need to happen to feel more comfortable in your own skin? Have a think about that. And someone says that it feels disloyal to oneself. Yeah. What would need to happen to feel more comfortable in your own skin? I'm thinking about that question myself, and my first thought was, oh, if I was more toned, if I, because I've hit menopause or perimenopause, I've been trying to strengthen my body a bit, and if I do a few sit-ups and a few press-ups, then I feel stronger, and it also boosts my testosterone. So I can feel a few muscles getting a bit more toned. And my first thought was, oh, I would feel more comfortable in my skin if I was more toned. But my deeper thought, and the true thought, is self-acceptance. Self-acceptance. Because our bodies, our shapes, our sizes, our skin, our complexion will continue to change and age. And unless we want to go for full-on surgery, which I think looks terrible afterwards anyway, this is what we have, right? This is what we have. And if I look at my imperfections and think that I wish they weren't there, then I'm not going to feel comfortable. So I think the answer for me is true self-acceptance and self-compassion and self-love. That's how we feel comfortable in our own skin. That's my thought. If you have any thoughts, please share. So someone says the first thought was if someone else told me they like me in my own skin, which isn't self-acceptance. So the problem with external sources of validation is they will change all the time, won't they? So someone will find us attractive, but the next person won't find us attractive, and that's okay, because that's how the world works. But if we depend on others for our self-worth, then and our self-esteem, then it's a dangerous game, because people are fickle, things can change. And we'll also likely, if we have this huge need for approval and acceptance, we will likely attract people who will abuse that, see that, manipulate us, abuse that. So self-acceptance, true self-acceptance, yeah, might be being too hard on ourselves, but how do we let that go? Yeah, we'll come to that. So important. We'll come on to that. Self-forgiveness and self-acceptance. But yes, little things can make a difference. So little acts of self-care. If you've done any of my coaching or how to fall in love courses, I talk about self-esteem comes from doing esteemable things. So that could be speaking up for ourselves, but it could also be little acts of self-care, painting toenails, using body lotion. So I don't know about you, but when I run out of body lotion, I can wait about 2 weeks before I manage to buy any more. And that's 2 weeks when my skin is dry. And as I said, right now I'm trying to do little bits of toning, little bits of strengthening. Really, it's about strengthening, because that's what I believe we need to do in middle age. And I just feel a tiny bit different and a tiny bit more confident. But ultimately, it comes down to self-acceptance, self-love, and those little acts of loving ourselves with by painting our toenails or putting some moisturizer in our hair or whatever it is. That, I think they help. They help send a signal to ourselves that we care about ourselves, that we cherish ourselves. It's not necessarily about changing how we look. It's about nurturing, cherishing, clean sheets. Yeah, that's a good point. Taking care of our surroundings. So we are worth it. So yeah, we are worth self-care. So just to recap a little bit on that, I showed you some pictures of me when I was younger and when I wore my pain on the outside with excess weight. And then some pictures of me when I wore my pain on the inside, when I was slim, but I was still engaged in binge eating and self-harm. And then we looked at the cost. So what is the cost to you in terms of your relationships, health, physical health, emotional health, in terms of companionship and feeling good in your body and at peace with yourself and comfortable in your own skin. And we looked at what might help us to feel comfortable in our own skin. So what I want to do now is talk about how many of us began these behaviors. So how did we start? When was it that we worked out that if we ate, overate, underate, numbed out in some way, drank, compulsively worked, compulsively exercised, when did we work out that might soothe us and take the pain away? There's nature and there's nurture. So my dear mum, who has passed away, she had her own struggles with addictive and compulsive behaviors. And in fact, the big picture is she had her own childhood trauma that led her to find ways to cope with life which were unhealthy. She had her own reasons for detaching from her feelings through using substances and behaviors. And I have a lot of compassion for her. And whether there was an addictive gene or whether I learned by seeing what was happening, so that might have been going on. Also, because my mum was disconnected from herself and her feelings, and I believe my dad was too, then when I show up in the world with a need, a biological need to connect on a deep level with my caregivers, and that connection isn't there. So I'm going to think there's something wrong with me. What's wrong with me? I don't belong here. How do I get soothed? I need to be soothed. I'm crying and I need to be soothed. I'm scared. I need to be soothed. And so they were the early, my very early memories of, I actually have an image in my head of me in a cot in the hallway and bawling as a baby, crying and crying and crying. And I don't know if that's actually true or if that's a memory that I have generated, or rather an image that I have generated. But like nobody coming, not being soothed. So I feel unsafe, I feel scared, maybe I'm hungry, maybe I'm angry, and nobody is coming to soothe me. And then later on, there were more specific things that happened in my life. So in my childhood home, things were a bit out of control. There was conflict between my parents. There was drinking and other ways of acting out. And there was, I knew something was up. I knew it was out of control. So there was some chaos. And the thing with when we're surrounded by chaos and it feels out of control, we look for ways to control. We look for ways to control. So one of the first things I did was to stop eating, to restrict what I was eating. And that was a way to feel in control. And it was also a way in my mind to be thinner and prettier and more acceptable to my parents. And this particularly became pronounced when my parents divorced and my dad left. And because it wasn't really explained to me what was happening, and I wasn't reassured that it wasn't my fault, then naturally, as all children do, when bad things are happening around us to the grown-ups, we think it's our fault. That's a natural childhood reaction, because as children, we think the whole world revolves around us. Freud talked about His Majesty, the baby. So I am in charge. I think I'm in charge of everything. So it's my fault that these people are unhappy, depressed, doing these things. And it's my fault that my dad left. So maybe if I'm prettier and thinner, more perfect, brilliant at school, maybe I will feel enough. So I started overeating. I started undereating to get thinner, to feel prettier, and to feel enough. And this is me as a little girl. And if you think about her unmet needs, what was she feeling? What were her needs? What did she need? What feelings couldn't she cope with? She couldn't cope with the fact that she thought it was her fault, that her parents didn't seem to be coping or doing their jobs. She felt unsafe. And what did she need? And how could she feel soothed? So I'll come on to that in a little bit. But yeah, I want you to think about your story. When did you first pick up on something? Food, drink. I mean, I know that I began apples. I was like addicted to apples when I was younger. I loved the crunch. It gave me something to do with my mouth. It was soothing. And then, crisps, again, the crunch, toast. It's always about the crunch and the carbs. And, it soothed me. It soothed me. And our stories are complex. As you can hear from mine, there is the nature nurture question. There is addiction or compulsive behaviors around me. There is the inability to connect to my caregivers, which is a primordial need. There is watching what's happening around me. There's the out of control scenario. How do I get some control? There's the feeling like it's my fault and then I'm not good enough and I need to be different, change myself to feel better. And then there are all the emotions that I didn't know how to feel. I don't have the coping mechanisms at that age to deal with the grief and the pain and the losing my dad and the thinking it was my fault. Even though he only moved some streets away, it's like he's gone. I didn't have the coping mechanisms. So there are all these feelings that I can't feel and that feel really painful. And I need to find a way to feel them. So I'd like you to think about your story. I'd like you to think about the reasons why you picked up on something when you were little. I imagine something started when you were little. The disconnection to your feelings, the unhealthy coping mechanisms. It may not have, for some of you who are watching perhaps on recording, it may not have started when you were little, but I imagine there was some disconnect. There was some break in your ability to learn how to cope with your emotions in healthy ways because you weren't soothed and you didn't have people around you who were helping you to process what was going on. So I'll give you a few minutes to make some notes about what might have happened, to prompt you to pick up on something, to use to manage your feelings in unhealthy ways, and feel free to share in the chat as well. So just before I share some of the comments, it just came to me, having read one, in my therapy, what I explore, some of the things I explore are around how early my wound was. And my therapist often says that we know your wound was early because of the gut issues. So if we have issues with our gut, with constipation, with diarrhea, with digestion, they generally signify an early wound. And when I was young, even before I started messing around with my food, I had constipation and I had diarrhea, especially when stressed, and I had issues with my gut. And I still have issues with my gut now, and it's one of the journeys I'm on, like the gut healing, especially after years of gut abuse. But I suppose I just want to emphasize that food, putting things in our mouth, if you think about dummies, like, I'm not sure they still give children dummies, but, we gave children dummies to soothe them, to silence them. We put things in our mouth, and kids are always putting stuff in their mouths, aren't they? And our dog is always doing the same as well. So it's kind of a natural biological thing to try and soothe ourselves. And I think back to the cavemen. So they would probably only eat once a day once they'd been out and hunted. But there was something about sitting down to a meal that sent a signal to their bodies that we're safe. Like, we've done our hunting, we've sorted everything out, and now we can sit down and eat. And that's a soothing thing, and it sends this signal to us that we're safe. So so somebody shares about having a restricted diet when young, ate a balanced diet but not a big range, having problems under the age of 5 eating in front of family, and find that now when around family. And I loved raw carrots, sweetest thing I had access to as a child. Yeah, that's sweet. We need that lift. We needed that lift. And interesting about restriction, I remember, in our household, there were no regular treats. So there were no biscuits in the cupboard or crisps in the cupboard. What happened was my mum would go to the shop of an evening and get what she needed, and we would get crisps and chocolate then. And it became like an addictive habit. But there was no sort of general niceties in the cupboard. And then my friend down the road, she always had yummy things like crisps and chocolate and biscuits in her house and a soda stream. And so there was a sense of lack, I suppose. They had all this stuff in this other house and we missed out on that. So, and I know many stories of women, especially whose parents put them on a diet when they were very young. And the messages that sends to us of, fat is wrong, or being curvaceous is wrong, or just being your body shape is wrong, because often it's just about body shape. And then we are taught from an early age to restrict, and that sets us up for a lifetime of restricting and binging and so forth. Confusing friendship as a child and death of a close relative, became people pleasing, Didn't like the way I looked when I had mumps, and then became vegetarian, restricting food. But it was part of the horror of death and suffering and overwhelming feeling. And didn't enjoy eating at the table, the noise and people messing around with their food. Thank you. Yeah, and another part of my story is we never ate round the table in our house. My mum used to prepare us a meal, and then she wouldn't eat with us, and my brother and I would eat our meal in front of the TV. And mum would never eat with us, and she would stand in the kitchen and pick and just eat the leftovers, or she wouldn't eat properly. So I think, that really taught me about self-neglect. And then I'd go to other people's houses, and meal times was like this big thing all around the table and conversation. And it was, wow, gosh, this is how other people live. It's either a sort of nature thing, that it's kind of in the genes, or it's what we've witnessed. Mum dieting. My mum had an incredible figure for much of her life, even after having children. And then all of a sudden, and I think this was through drinking, she put on weight, and a lot of weight. And then it was really obvious that something had changed, and I didn't know what. And then I can't really remember her battle with weight, but it must have been there. Yeah. Mum dieting, but dad's large stomach was just seen as funny. Yeah. I mean, you might also have little memories of, gosh, I have memories from my young years. I remember a photo taken of me lying on my tummy in my friend's garden. I was sunbathing, so I had little shorts on, and I'm on my tummy. And her dad, who was absolutely lovely, but he just made some sort of comment about my body shape, and it stayed with me. It stayed with me because my friend at the time, my best friend, her daughter was skinny, and I was normal. And normal wasn't skinny enough in my book. And I also remember one of my friends at school saying something about, she drew a picture of me, my face, and then a double chin. And that stayed with me too. So we get these little messages that there's something wrong with us, and that it's not right to be how we are, to look how we are. I think one of the most important aspects, and this is where I think this is one of the cruxes of the recovery healing journey, is to understand what feelings we were trying to soothe, what we were trying to escape from or disconnect from when we were young. And so for me, as I say, like, if I don't feel good enough or pretty enough, or if I feel a lot of grief or pain or anger, and I don't know how to feel those feelings, I'm going to eat. I'm going to eat. I'd like you to do an exercise for me. And some of you might, if you've done coaching with me, you might have done this before. But I'd love you to do it again, even if you have, because it's relevant to this particular situation and workshop. So I showed you a picture earlier of me as a little girl. So here she is, and she's got some feelings going on. And I could think of a moment in my childhood when she has some strong feelings going on. Maybe my mum's there with one of her boyfriends, and she feels unsafe. She feels scared. She feels neglected. She feels unloved. She feels angry, perhaps. So I want you to think about, it could be just thinking generally about your childhood, or think about a specific time when you as a little girl had feelings, strong feelings, that you weren't able to express. And we're going to do this quickly, and you might want to do this again yourself after the workshop. But I'd like you to take your pen or pencil in your non-dominant hand. So if you're left-handed, put it in your right and vice versa. And I'd like you to write a little note about how you feel. So this, you could pick, I'm age 6 and this is happening, or I'm age 9 and this is happening, or this is a general sense of my childhood. So I'd just like you to write a few lines of how I feel. And it might be a specific memory, or it might be a general sense. So you do that with your non-dominant hand, and I'll give you a few minutes and I'll just pause. So we've been doing our non-dominant handwriting about that time or general sense of how we felt in childhood. And someone shares that something that came to mind, felt that I could not bear the feeling. I was hurting and probably distraught. I felt loss and grief. I felt lonely and also wrong. Yeah. So they're pretty profound feelings, and very much relates to something that I wrote yesterday, and I'll share that with you in a moment. So you as a little girl, you felt lonely and wrong and hurt and distraught and with a lot of grief. Someone else shares worried, wobbly inside, afraid, lonely, better to be on my own in my bedroom, and then feeling physical things, dryness of throat, worried about choking, hungry, sad, a bit panicky. So that's a physical trigger, sort of a trauma response, the body responding. So I did this exercise yesterday myself, and I'll show you my very scribbly writing, which you can barely read. I can't actually remember exactly which incident I was writing about. Could have been around my dad moving out, or perhaps around some chaotic behavior at home. But I wrote, I feel like it's my fault. There's something wrong with me. I feel scared, unsafe, confused, alone, and angry. And I'll just say something about anger, because it's a really important emotion, and I think not discussed enough. So if you look at children who are growing up in a healthy way, with caregivers who are emotionally connected and doing a reasonable job, and this is not to blame anyone, because we all have our own struggles. So I understand that my parents did the best they could. But if you look at children who are growing up in a healthy way, they have a lot of anger. They'll have a rant, or they'll yell, or they'll scream, or they'll say I hate you, and they'll shout, and they'll let it out. So for many of the women I work with, and myself, like, we were good girls, and we kept it in. So anger was a taboo. I mean, even I remember even just expressing a need to my mum, a want to my mum, not even anger, but just expressing my need. And in response came anger towards me, and that shut me down. And I felt, okay, I'm never going to say a want or need again. And absolutely, I'm never going to get angry, because it's not acceptable. I'll get anger in return, and that's frightening. When a big person is angry with you, when you're a small person, then that's really frightening, especially if this person is responsible for your well-being and you can't survive without them. That's really frightening. So we became good girls, and that's not everyone's case. Some of you may have rebelled and slammed doors and got angry, but I very much remember the day my dad told my brother and I that he was getting remarried to someone we barely knew and had very little contact with, and there was very little explanation. I sat on his knee and cried, and my brother stormed out and slammed the door. And I was the good girl. I couldn't get angry, and I couldn't express my needs and wants. And the thing about anger is it needs to come out, and anger, often we turn it inwards. So binge eating is anger turned inwards. Any form of overeating is anger turned inwards. If you think about other forms of self-harm, which are perhaps more physical, that's anger turned inwards. And then there's an extension to anger, which might be more subtle, but just as harmful to us, which is resentment. So when we live with resentment, when we feel bitter, when we're not able to express ourselves, and one of our biggest resentments is often towards ourselves. So I think about I was thinking about this morning when I used to work for Reuters as a political journalist. We had to work on Sundays. Nobody else worked on Sundays. So I used to cycle down to Fleet Street in London. It was dead. There was no one else at work, and everyone was having fun. And I was on my own in the office. I felt so resentful that I had to do that job. Didn't know the way out. Felt really angry that I was working on a Sunday. And I would eat because I felt resentful and angry. And I mean, this is a whole other topic, but many of us use binge, eat, scroll, watch TV, numb out, because we're resentful about the position that we are in, about the job that we're doing, about the lack of sunlight and fun in our lives. We feel resentful, and we've got nothing, we don't know how to express that, so we end up turning it on ourselves and harming ourselves. So and I remember in one of my very first therapy sessions, like 20 years ago, the therapist saying, well, what about anger? And I just went, no, don't have that. Not relevant to me. Don't have any anger. Don't feel anger. So that's not possible. Anger is one of the core emotions. And of course I had anger. It was all turned in on myself, with the binging and the starving and the running and the self-harming. So if I think back to my childhood and all that stuff that was going on, and my needs not getting met, I had every right to be angry. What the hell's going on here? Like, will you just sort yourselves out? But I didn't say anything, and I just turned it inwards on myself. So I'll just pause. I just see, does anyone have any do you relate to what I've said around anger, just as an aside? If you want to share anything about that, please do in the chat. Do you recognize you have swallowed your anger? Do you recognize that you have turned it on yourself? Do you recognize that there is bubbling resentment that isn't expressed or worked through or processed towards yourself or others, and that leads you into unhealthy behaviors? So just have a think about that. Absolutely. So I can very much relate to that. So as a child, my parents' anger, especially my dad's, was frightening. So I didn't want to trigger it by having my own needs. So not only could we not be angry ourselves, which is kind of what happens in children. Children get angry, but we couldn't even express our needs in case they didn't go down well. And I absolutely relate to that. And then we suppress our needs and our wants, and we suppression is depression. Like, we suppress, and or we stuff, and we shrink, and we're silent, and we're a good girl, and we keep it inside. If you can't express your anger outwards, it makes sense that we do it to ourselves. So there are all these emotions that are happening to us when we're children or adolescents, and we don't know how to express our feelings. We don't know how to, or it's not safe to express our feelings, and we don't know how to express our needs and wants. So I'm going to continue on this theme in a moment, about our needs, and what our needs were, and how we didn't have them met, and how we can try and meet them today, because that's what we want to do when we get into the recovery phase. So I'm just going to pause now, and we'll take a break. So let me pause the recording.